You've been studying the Mongol Empire for a very long time now. What brought you into that field? How did you become interested in the Mongols?
It was when I was about 14. A school friend of mine lent me a copy of A History of the Mongols, Michael Pravdin's The Mongol Empire, Its Rise and Legacy, first published, I think, in 1940. "This is interesting, David," he said. "You might like to read it." And I read it, and I looked at a map of the Mongol Empire. I thought, why does nobody know about this? It's so huge. It seems to include almost everywhere in the old world. So that got me interested. And I lost touch with my friend for probably 35 years. I happened to run into him. And he said, "What are you doing now, David?" And I said, "Well, Roger, I'll tell you. And what's more, it's entirely your fault," which was a very nice moment. So that's what got me interested. Then I won a school prize, and I spent it on John Boyle's translation of Juvayni's History of the World Conqueror. And that got me going. And then I gave my first ever talk on the Mongols to the Sixth Form Historical Society at my school. The talk lasted for 2 hours. I sometimes tell this story to audiences to whom I'm talking about the Mongols, and seeing the look of alarm in their faces, I then tend to add, "But don't worry, I know a lot less about the subject now than I did in 1962. You know, the trouble with what little people knew about the Mongols 50 years ago was that it was thought to be a phenomenon mainly about death and destruction. You know, the Mongols were a military phenomenon. They had come and killed millions of people, destroyed cities, and had really done very little else. So it was pretty negative and pretty superficial, really. This has changed. The military side of the Mongol phenomenon, which is and was very, very remarkable. There's no question about that. But there is more to it than that, and the military side of things has been given much closer attention than was previously the case. It's no longer wild, undirected hordes charging across the steppe and slaughtering everybody in their way. There's organisation, there are tactics, there's strategy, there's careful thought. There's arrangements for supplies and logistics generally and so forth, which has been worked on very productively, not least by you in your first book. What has also changed very significantly, I think, is that there's been a shift of attention and emphasis away from the purely military and certainly away from the purely destructive side of the Mongol phenomenon. Sometimes this has been, in my view, rather overdone. I mean, there are scholars working now for whom the Mongols were extremely nice people, kind to children and animals, and wouldn't hurt a fly. I don't think that the evidence will really bear so much of a re-emphasis as that.
Over your long career, you've written several books, you've edited many others. Which of all those books do you think has had the greatest impact?
I think it must surely be the book I wrote called The Mongols, which was first published in 1986, and then I updated it a bit for a new edition in 2007. One of the things that I found quite touching when the book was first published was that I got a lot of letters about it from people I didn't know at all. Mm-hmm. I remember, and I've still got it somewhere, a letter from a Liverpool docker saying that he'd picked it up somewhere or other and how interesting he found it. I thought, well, you know, if what I write is reaching people like that, then maybe I'm actually doing something faintly useful.
During the 1980s and 1990s, you were the editor of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. When you became the editor, what did you set out to do?
My feeling when I was asked to become editor in about 1987, I think it was that it had tended to become a rather antiquarian journal. That is to say that you would have a lot of articles about this or that inscription, the text clearly established and possibly even an English translation, and that would be that. It provided often very sound scholarly information, but in many cases they tended to be articles that, it seemed to me, didn't really make you think. So what I decided to do was to try and shift the emphasis. Not necessarily regionally, although while I was editor, the number of articles published on the Middle East as against, say, South Asia did tend to increase. But that, I think, was not because it was my preference, but because people sending in articles thought it would be my preference because I was a historian of the Middle East and Central Asia myself. But what I tended to do was to read articles that were sent in, submitted for publication, and at the end of reading the article, I would ask the question, so what? And if the answer was, well, so nothing, I mean, that's it, then I wouldn't publish the article, even if it was perfectly sound scholarship. It seemed to me that articles should lead somewhere, that there should be somewhere to go after reading this article, that should be a pointer to further research, that it should make people think about other issues and so forth.
Although you're primarily known for working with the Mongols, you're also I would say a celebrated figure in the study of Islamic history. And indeed, your position at Wisconsin was specifically for Islamic history. So what do you see as the current trends or changes in Islamic history these days?
When I came to SOAS as a PhD student, one of the first things I did was to decide that I must learn up some Islamic history. So I read a number of books that I thought would be helpful, and I went to the lectures on the Caliphate by the then head of the history department at SOAS, the celebrated historian Bernard Lewis, who will be 100 this year. They were absolutely brilliant and far better than could be found in those days in any published book. And that's what's changed. That the standard works available in Islamic history in those days, that with honourable exceptions, were basically amateur books. I mean, not by people who were not necessarily amateurs in their own field, but their own field was likely to be literature or something else, not history. They weren't professional historians. All credit to them for writing the books they did, because if they hadn't, nobody else would have done. But the big change since then has been the effective professionalization of Islamic history, so that it can now hold up its head without any feeling of embarrassment in amongst all the other fields of historical research and study. One of the snags about a field which has a comparatively limited number of practitioners is this: the fields that you and I work in. The scholars who operate in that sort of area are comparatively limited in number compared to those who work in, say, British history or American history or whatever. And so there is a tendency, if one of us writes a really good book on a major subject, for that to become definitive. If a book on a historical matter can be justly described as definitive, what that means is that the field of study is dead. There is no such thing as a definitive work in his history. Everything is subject to revision in the light of new work, new research, new thinking, new sources, and so on. But you can't sometimes find these great books which really have a longer life than they should have. One should wish, as a historian, to be superseded. If anybody is still reading my book on the Mongols in 50 years' time, except for historiographical purposes, then this will be a thoroughly bad thing, because it should have been superseded, and it may well be that the books that you're writing will do precisely that.
Let's go back and visit your younger self. What kind of advice would you give yourself with the wisdom of age and scholarship?
What I would do, I think, assuming that I was competent to do it, bearing in mind the field of study that I've specialised in, is that at an early stage I would have attempted to learn more languages. you cannot really get at a historical scene and understand what was going on if you don't know the language of the people that you're studying. You're always at one remove if you're doing it through translations. And this is what I feel about my knowledge of the history of China. I'm always at one remove because I can only do it through translation. So although I did, I learnt up to a point the usual languages at school, you know, Latin, Greek, French, German, whatnot. I'd never really learnt the languages that are really ideally necessary for the study of the history of the Mongol Empire. I knew Persian, I learnt some Arabic, but I never learnt Mongolian or Chinese or any of the other various languages that would be necessary. And my advice to anybody who is starting in this field of study now would be, in the first instance, first of all, be, if possible, better at languages than I was, and secondly, learn more of them so that you can read the sources in the original language. It's never safe to rely on a translation. You always have to check it when it really matters against the original. And of course, in the case of Persian sources, I can do that. In the case of Chinese or Mongolian sources, I can't. And that is a limitation that I would wish not to have had. In my retirement, what I'm hoping to do is to, I've written some of this, to write a study of the Ilkhanate, that's to say of the period of Mongol rule in Iran. This has not really been done since 1939, when the distinguished German scholar Bertold Spuler published the first edition of his Die Mongolen in Iran, the Mongols in Iran. 1939 is a long time ago. A lot has happened in the scholarship, and it wouldn't be a bad thing for someone to draw it together into an overall survey, and I'm hoping to be able to do that.